All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations based on the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm just about through now with the JavaScript portion. So I've done the getting started with the web, the HTML, structuring the web, the CSS, styling the web, and when I say I'm almost done, I should say that I'm almost done with 4 out of 5. So I'm almost done here with asynchronous JavaScript. So when I get done, I'll have just the client-side web APIs to go. But I'm on the choosing the right approach right now. So the author, they say here, will provide a brief discussion of the different coding techniques and features that have been discussed in here. So in other words, callbacks versus promises versus async await. All right. Again, callbacks are generally found in old-style APIs. As it says, it involves a function being passed into another function as a parameter, which is then invoked when an asynchronous operation has been completed. Now, does that mean you'll never see them even in new code? And the answer is no. You will. All right. It says they're a precursor to promises. They're not as efficient or flexible. Use only when necessary, but sometimes people use them anyway. All right, notice what are they useful for? Repeating operations and multiple sequential operations. What are they not useful for? Single delayed operations and multiple simultaneous operations. And this was very similar to an example that we looked at earlier. But again, it involves a function being passed into another function as a parameter. That function is then invoked when the asynchronous option has been completed, so that the callback can do something with the result. Problems with this, as it says, nested callbacks can lead to that callback hell that we talked about. Failure callbacks need to be called once for each level of nesting, so you don't have just the single catch that you have with promises. They aren't graceful for the reasons just mentioned. Promise callbacks are always called in the strict order they are placed in the event queue, whereas async callbacks are not. Async callbacks lose full control of how a function will be executed when passed to a third-party library. So they're older technology. They're not as refined technology, but they're still used. And you'll still find a lot of it out there. There's really good general support even with older browsers. So we've already looked at this section earlier of introducing the asynchronous JavaScript. All right, where we talked about callbacks. We got into set timeout intended, and set interval. All right, set timeout, if you remember, it allows us to run a function once after an arbitrary amount of time has passed, typically only once. Again, useful for delayed execution, useful for repeating operations, useful for multiple sequential operations, not useful for multiple simultaneous operations. You can use, as mentioned here, recursive set timeout to call a function repeatedly. We looked at that in an earlier example. We also looked at in an earlier example the differences between the recursive set timeout and set interval. As it said, the recursive set timeout guarantees at least the specified amount of time will elapse between execution, where the set interval includes the time taken to execute the code we want it to run in. All right, so if you say 100 seconds and you want it to be 100 seconds regardless, you'd use set timeout. When your code has the potential to take longer to run than the interval you've assigned, you're better off using set timeout. Remember that there is a clear interval and a clear timeout. If you use set timeout, you should clear it with clear timeout. If you use set interval, you should clear it with clear interval, although I believe we said that it was possible to use clear interval to clear either a timeout or an interval. Browser compatibility, again, you'll notice it virtually has all. And it says Node.js has partial. We won't worry about that for right now. So again, set interval, as it says, allows you to run a function repeatedly. I liken set timeout to the old-fashioned wind-up alarm clock. All right, where it goes off, you push the button and boom, that's it. You're expected to be up. Whereas set interval was more like, using like a clock radio or something that, or an alarm that has a snooze on it, type of an idea. Again, set interval. Is it good? It is useful for repeating operations, but not for single delayed operations, multiple sequential operations, or multiple simultaneous operations. See, it's pretty much the same as what we saw up here. From there, we went into request animation frame, which is the newer way of doing this. And again, quite often used with animations, as it says. It's a method that allows you to run a function repeatedly and more efficiently. You should, if at all possible, use this instead of set interval recursive or recursive set timeout, unless you have a specific reason or you need a specific frame rate. Notice, though, useful for repeating operations, yes, but for single delayed operations, no. For multiple sequential operations, no. For multiple simultaneous operations, no. And we looked a little bit at this spinner example. Pitfalls, as it says there, you can't choose a specific frame rate. If you need to run an animation at a slower frame rate, you'll need to use set interval or the recursive set timeout. Notice it has full support. From there, we went into promises. All right. And as it says, promises are a JavaScript feature that allow you to run asynchronous operations and wait until it is definitely complete before running another operation based on the result. As mentioned, promises are kind of the backbone of modern asynchronous JavaScript. They're used all over the place in web APIs. They're useful for multiple sequential operations, but not for single delayed operations or repeating operations. For multiple simultaneous operations, you would use the promise.all. We went through this example. Promise chains can be hard and can be complex and hard to parse. All right, not as bad as the callback hell that you get with async, but as mentioned, if you nest a number of promises, you can end up with similar problems to the callback hell. You're better chaining and doing it this way. And when you chain, there's ways that you can cut it down, etc. Notice not at all by Internet Explorer. All right. And some stuff with different versions of Opera in here as well. All right, we looked a little bit at Promise All, which, as it says, is a JavaScript feature that allows you to wait for multiple promises to complete before running a further operation based on the results of the earlier promises. Useful for multiple simultaneous operations, but not for single delayed operations, repeating operations, or multiple sequential operations. And you can see, again, no IE support. And we finished up by talking about Async Await. And as mentioned there, they call it syntactic sugar. I call it a wrapper on top of promises that allow you to run asynchronous operation using syntax that makes it look more like synchronous code than asynchronous code. Useful for multiple sequential operations and multiple simultaneous operations, but not for repeating operations or single delayed operations. Pitfalls, as it said, you can't use the await operation inside a non-async function, and browser support is not as good as it is for promises. Again, no IE support. Now that's it again for this one. So when I come back in just a moment, we are going to jump into the last part of this. So we are now done with the asynchronous JavaScript, and we're going to jump into client-side web APIs. All right, so I'll be back with that one in just a couple minutes.